Michelle Robson, editor of Turning Left for Less. Welcome to the latest edition of This Week in Travel. In this edition, we'll be looking at the latest news, including some really good offers from Virgin Points and also from Accor. I'll also be talking to Ed, who works for Turning Left for Less as a writer, but is actually a pilot in real life in his day job. And I'll also be talking about my 23 years of experience in air traffic control. We'll be looking at the most frequently asked questions, such as weather, turbulence, emergencies, etc. And also looking at a day in the life of a controller and a pilot and how we got to do those jobs. But first, let's have a look at the latest news. In France, there's due to be another strike after the one today, which is the 16th of February. The next one is due to be on the 7th of March and will affect all aspects of transport, including flights and trains, and that includes Eurostar. So if you're planning to travel in France or to France on that date, you need to be looking at what the airline or train company is saying about the likelihood of your transport actually going. The strikes are over the French government's plans to raise the retirement age. Also this week, there's a great offer from Virgin Points that's just arrived. If you're a member of Virgin Flying Club and we're thinking of redeeming some points, now's probably the time to do it. The offer gives you 30% off flights in any class, so economy, premium economy or upper class, when you book using your points. The offer is valid until the 28th of February. If you go to the website and redeem as normal, it should show you the reduced price. If you want to find out more details, all the details are on turningleftforless.com and I've put the link below. Accor have a sale coming up that starts on the 28th of February. So if you're looking at going to the Maldives, you might want to hold fire. You can have a look in advance and see what hotels they have in the Maldives that you might be interested in, but it will be giving up to 30% off, which is quite a substantial discount when we all know how pricey the Maldives can be. Not only does it feature the Maldives, it will also have Southeast Asia, Japan and Korea. This starts on the 28th of February and we'll be putting all the details on Turning Left for Less. Virgin Hotels have just announced the opening of their latest hotel, which is in New York. It's in the Nomad district, which is basically north of Madison. It's typical of a Virgin hotel, as you'd expect. It's very modern, very innovative. You can control some of the features in your room with an app, which I think is quite fun. And it joins other Virgin hotels, such as the one in Edinburgh and Las Vegas. There's due to be another one in the UK shortly with the opening of the Glasgow one. If you're a Virgin Points collector, you can now get points on Virgin Hotels, but you do need to join the In the Know, which is the Virgin Hotels loyalty programme, and that way you can collect your Virgin Points. Now let's have a look at the feature of this week, which is about pilots and controllers. So today's guest is Ed. Ed is part of the Turning Left for Less team. So if you're a regular reader, you've probably read some of his reviews under Ed the Pilot. So it's no surprise that Ed is indeed a pilot. And I'm actually a former air traffic controller. So today we're going to be talking about flying as a pilot and my experience on the ground in air traffic control. So welcome, Ed. Why not start by telling us a little bit about your pilot career?
Perfect. So I fly regional jets. We fly all over Scandinavia, mainly Norwegian domestics, some to Sweden, a little bit to the Baltic, and down towards Germany, France, the UK. I started as a cadet in 2017 and then became a second officer in 2019. COVID hit, which was not particularly pleasant, but flying is now getting back to where it needs to be.
So what does the typical training, I know for pilots or potential pilots, one of the worst things is actually getting your license because it's hugely expensive and not many airlines now sponsor that. So can you talk us a little bit through about how someone becomes a pilot?
Absolutely. So I was a cadet, so we were interviewed beforehand by the airline and they picked us. There's about 10 of us. And what we did was we then had to pay for our initial course. We would go to Oxford Aviation for about 7 months where we would do our ground license exams for the licenses. There's 14 of them. It takes a long time. There's a lot of knowledge needed for those exams. But once you're done, that's it. You don't need to do them again, which is fantastic. And then we move on to actually flying airplanes. So we went out to Phoenix for 6 months and we flew Piper PA-28, so a single engined plane. It sits 4 people, but an instructor would go up with me and my flight partner, and we would do an hour's lesson and then swap. So that's the initial training. That's out in Phoenix, so the weather's much nicer than it is here. And then we would move on to a multi-engine aircraft. It's called a Seminole. Again, only seats 4 people, very small, very tight, and very underpowered for Phoenix because it's very hot there. And then once we'd passed our commercial license in that aircraft, we did a test in Phoenix where we basically were examined by the CAA to make sure we could fly the aircraft. And in fact, for me, because I worked for an Irish airline, we were examined under both the CAA and the EASA, the IAA for Ireland. So effectively, I did 4 tests in one. And then after that, we've got our commercial pilot's license. We still can't fly the planes because the license hasn't been issued, but we then came home for another 6 months. And in Oxford, we then flew Senecas, which are 6-seater aircraft, slightly bigger, slightly more powerful. And they fly in cloud. That's basically the training we did in Oxford. My first lesson on the Seneca was supposed to be visual. We were supposed to be able to see the ground, but the weather was so poor, we were straight into cloud immediately. So not one of the flights that I did around Oxford could I actually see the ground. It was all simulated instrument stuff. And so from the beginning to the end, it's about 18 months. We do another test at the end of Oxford. So there's 2 major tests there. And then, as you say, lots of paperwork. We briefly go to Gatwick for about 3 weeks where we learn to fly a jet. In my case, it was the 737 to work with another pilot. And then it is the paperwork. It can be up to £1,000 just to get the bit of paper in your hand after you've paid for all the training. I had to hop over to Ireland in person because it was taking so long. And then we do our initial training on the aircraft that I've been picked to fly, the CRJ, which takes another 6 weeks or so.
So that's surprising, actually. I thought it wouldn't be quite as long as that because it sounds almost similar to air traffic control. So I thought I'd kind of talk a bit about my experience. So I was in air traffic control for 23 years. Hopefully I don't look like that old. I started very young, a lad, very young, straight out of college. And most of that time I was a controller. So controlling now is easier to get the qualifications. It's a bit quicker. They've shortened it down, but I'll talk a bit about my experience. So initially, after a lot of interviews, I was taken on at their own college where you're actually paid whilst you train, which you can't complain at that. And that used to take around about 6 months, very similar to you, doing all the kind of boring book work that you know, the kind of basics of it. And during that time, you did do some practical stuff as well. You initially learned to control aircraft at an airport, and then you move on to your specialism, which in my case was area control, or you might do approach, which would be if you were going to work in an airport. And as part of that, I actually did some flying training. They've cut that out now, which I think is a huge shame. So I got to do 15 hours at Booker Airfield. And I did in fact go solo, and it was the most terrifying 20 minutes of my entire life, which is why I am not a pilot. I could do the kind of basics of flying because that actually didn't feel too difficult to me, but the navigating at the same time, I literally didn't have a clue where I was, and I was just going around like turning left all the time and in the hope that I would get back to where I started, which I did, and I managed to land, and I'm here to tell the tale. But yes, I definitely did. I was pleased that I did it, but yeah, it was not for me flying in something that's smaller than my car. That just seems wrong. And then after that, we did a few practical things like spending time with British Airways, which again, unfortunately, they've cut that out, but we sat in the cockpit, which was great to understand the pilot's point of view. And then you go to the particular airfield or unit, in my case, and do your practical training there. Initially, it's all on a simulator. You'll be pleased to know they don't let you loose on the flying public straight away. You do a simulator course for your particular area that you're going to do. Mine was from Heathrow up to Manchester and then out to Ireland and Scotland. So that was kind of 2 sectors. So you train in the simulator, and then you then train for about another year live with somebody who can take over should you make a mistake and not correct it. But obviously they try and get you to correct your own mistakes after the initial few weeks. but the whole thing used to take, I think, around about 3 years, but it is a bit quicker now. And it's very difficult. It's one of those things I think you're kind of born with. You need to think in 3D, and you also need to be fairly assertive, because we get to boss you pilots around. So you've got to be able to sound like you're confident in your decision, so that the pilot's not questioning you. But I think it's something like 1% of people that apply actually get through to the end. So I was really pleased that I made that. So that's kind of my story of training, and I thought it's quite interesting. I don't really know what a pilot does all day apart from press a few buttons, so I thought it would be quite nice for you to run through what would be a typical day when you're at work. How does it kind of start, and what do you do before you get to the aircraft, etc.?
Yeah, so it's normally a very early wake-up call for us in the regional world, somewhere between 4 and 5 a.m. We then, normal stuff, shower, breakfast, get in the uniform, and then we have the airline organizes a taxi for us to get to the airfield when you're away from home. And for me, based in Tallinn, I was always away from home. I was always in Copenhagen. So they organize a taxi and they take you to the airport. We then have to go through security just like you guys. It's slightly different for pilots in that we can normally take a bottle of water through. In Europe anyway, you can't in the UK. But yeah, so we go through security, and then we have another vehicle to take us to our aircraft. We get to the aircraft. We've ordered fuel by this point. Catering's done for us. We don't have to worry about that. And then when we get to the aircraft, we put our luggage into the hold ourselves, because we're on tiny regional jets where we can reach the hold. Open the aircraft up. The cabin crew go through and do a security check to make sure no one's left anything suspicious on board. We then split tasks. Whoever's flying first types in the route and all the information and prepares the flight deck. And then the other pilot goes and does a walk around. Now, that means they wander around the outside of the aircraft, and they're just making sure that there's no big dents, we're not missing any bits, because you don't want to take off with things like that.
No.
In my case, once I noticed that the engineers had left the gear pins in, which stopped the landing gear retracting. So if we'd taken off, we'd have had to keep low and slow, which is not pleasant for anyone. So that's how we warm up the aircraft. Then we get on the passengers, as you'll all be aware, and we've shut the door by this point because law forbids us to have it open in flight. So at that point, we start talking to air traffic control. We have ground clearance, who will let us back and give us taxi route, and then our actual routing as well. And then we're talking to the ground staff. They also do a walk around to make sure that the plane's fine. And once all the passengers on board, the cabin crew come in with a list of how many people are on board, and we compare that to our list and make sure everything's matched up. We then fly the route. Normally it's as said in the instruction pack we've got, but if air traffic control set you direct, great, a shortcut. And it's very easy. It's just a couple button pushes. So normally with the airline, we take off, and then at about 600 to 1,000 feet, we put the autopilot on. We can fly higher if we want, but it's on from about 500 feet normally. Fly the route, and as we come into our descent, we'll give you an announcement to say we're descending, and that's announcement basically to get the cabin crew ready. And then once we're passing through 10,000 feet in both directions, we can't talk about anything other than the flight itself. So we're very concentrated on that. We then land at whichever airport we're at, taxi into wherever we need to be. And the same thing repeats. The pilot who's flying, normally the other pilot, we alternate. The other pilot will do the programming, and the first one will go and do the walk around. And we repeat that 3 or 4 times a day. In fact, with my airline, sometimes 5 times a day. Which is a little tiring sometimes, but it's all, the duty days are completely regulated. Depending when you start, there's a very clear time when you finish. So yeah, that's a fairly average day.
So how many days in a row would you generally work, and then how long would you get off?
So with my airline, it depends on your base. If you work in some bases, you do 5 days on, 2 days on, off, 5 days on, 3 days off. For me, it was slightly less regulated. So we could do up to 7 days on, although sometimes normally the first or last day was just traveling home, positioning as on a ticket paid for by the airline. And then for me, it was normally 3, sometimes 2, but 3 or 4 days in the middle after 7. It meant I could commute home to London, so I didn't have to live in Tallinn.
So that sounds similar kind of pattern to air traffic control. So I'll kind of run through what my day used to be like. So we work more varied shifts because it's a 24-hour operation. Some people at airports would work slightly more normal hours because places like London City close overnight. So we would work 6 days on, 4 days off generally. Occasionally have a slightly different pattern, and we'd start with 2 mornings that started at 6:30 a.m, which I hated. I'm not a morning person. And then we'd have 2 afternoons, and then you'd either do 2 night shifts or 2 day shifts, or mornings or afternoons again, which are called spins, because at night it's much quieter, so they don't need as many people. And when you first go into the operation, you would brief yourself and see if there's anything unusual happening that day. And then you would go and look at where you're positioned to sit. So each person generally does 2 to 3 sectors, and you're generally rostered for one, but it's very unlikely you'd sit there all day. You generally move around. They try not to keep moving you backwards and forwards because I think it's difficult to remember, especially when you've got sectors that are very different and require different skills. It's a bit unsettling to keep moving. Yeah. So generally you'll do maybe 1 or 2 of the sectors a day. First thing in the morning, it's generally very busy, sort of 7 o'clock. I'm sure you're familiar with that, where everybody starts their first rotation. So you'd be working really hard. So you probably only work about an hour. When it's quieter, you can work up to 2 hours. And then you'd have a half an hour break where I worked at the London Centre, which is actually not in London, it's down on the south coast. There you'd go and have your breakfast. There's a canteen on site, so you'd go and have a break, then come back and kind of repeat that throughout the day. And you would generally work in a team of people. At night you might work on your own, but generally you work with one other person who's called your planner, and sometimes there's an assistant that will help as well, depending on how busy you are. And there's a supervisor, which I did that role for a few years later on in my career. A supervisor will look after 2 groups of controllers, generally around 12 to 1 supervisor, and they're looking at the traffic coming. So is it going to be busy? If it's going to be too busy and they don't have, you can only split the sector in so many different ways. If you're going to get to the point where you can't split it any further, or you don't have enough staff, then they're looking at putting delays on, which I know pilots hate. And quite often, I'm sure they sneakily say it's air traffic control when it's not, but we'll gloss over that bit. And then they're looking at putting on delays. So that's kind of the roles in the room. And then there's one overall supervisor who would deal with the more serious type of things and keep an eye on the whole room. So that's kind of an average day in a controller.
Yeah, there was definitely a story that I remember from, because I'm doing a master's degree in air transport management, talking about blaming air traffic control. There was a Ryanair pilot who did that, but unfortunately there was a controller on the plane who then checked up on it, but he then complained, and it was a serious incident that Ryanair had told the passengers that it was air traffic control. So most of the time we try not to, but occasionally you sneak one in.
See, I knew it. I knew they were fibbing. It's not always our fault. Well, I've learnt the truth now. You've let it out of the bag. But I'm sure your airline didn't do that, Ed. I'm sure.
No, absolutely not.
No, absolutely. So you kind of said about a serious incident. That leads nicely into our next topic, which is emergencies and unusual incidents. So a kind of couple of questions for you to cover. Have you ever had an incident where it was something unusual or some sort of an emergency? Have you ever had a disturbance on board? You know, we read so much about passengers drinking too much and being difficult. Have you had any of those sort of events?
So I think the answer for me is all of the above. Haven't had any drunk passengers, but we have had a couple of passengers who overdosed on the flight. And what was really annoying about that, it was the end of a 5-sector day. So it was a very long day anyway. There'd already been maintenance issues, and it was very long. When we landed, the cabin crew came in and said, "Captain, I think 2 of the passengers have died," because they were just completely unresponsive. So we had to get medics, and when they started to be able to be rousable, they started waking up. We were able to move them to the front of the plane because our plane only has a door at the front. There's overwing exits, but no door at the back. So we had to move them to the front of the plane, got armed police and airport security and medics out, and we were finally able to get them off the plane. And they were very upset because they weren't allowed to continue on to their connecting flight, which of course was to Amsterdam. So that's the main medical I think I've had. I don't think I've had any other major medical things, but The worst incident for me was on my line check, which is a flight at the end of your sort of 3 months training on the actual plane. You're with training captains, and then they say, okay, you can fly with normal captains now. And we were flying Birmingham to Copenhagen, and this aircraft was slightly broken anyway. It had a faulty fuel gauge, so we had a bit of paper where we just had to write it down. It's perfectly serviceable. It's just annoying for us as flight crew. And on the way back, I was relieved by the captain. He was going to fly it for a bit, and it was my flight. And so I put my chair as far back as possible, took my shoulder straps off, and started eating, because we have to eat. And he said, "Oh, can you pass me that bit of paper?" So I started looking over to my right for the bit of paper, and suddenly I heard an alarm go off, and I went, "Huh, that sounds like the autopilot disconnecting. It can't be. We're at 38,000 feet." Looked around, and it in fact had. So of course grabbed the yoke, the control column, and captain's screens had failed, one of our navigation units had failed, a yaw damper had failed, and a couple of other things had failed. Now, the autopilot failing by itself is no big deal. We can fly that. We just need to go at a lower altitude. But the number of things that failed, it was a little suspicious, and we'd been warned in flight school that if random things start failing, you may have a fire on board. And the time from a fire starting to aircraft loss on average is about 18 minutes. So you really need to get on the ground in that case. Now, when we went through the checklist, it turns out we didn't have a fire, so that was fine. But various different bits of the aircraft had still failed. And the cabin crew, of course, they knocked on the door and went, "Oh, do you have the passenger connection list?" Which is a little bit of paper that tells passengers where to go for the next flight. And we said, "No, we're a little busy, slight emergency here, so we don't have that." And he said, "Oh, I'll come back later." So not completely with it that day, but we had to then make a decision whether to divert to Amsterdam, which we could see just off the right-hand side of the aircraft, or continue to Copenhagen. And because various things had failed, we decided to continue to Copenhagen, because both of us knew it well. So even if various different screens had failed and we were just using our standby instruments, we'd still be able to land safely. So we continued, and in the descent, the captain started briefing the cabin crew on a NITS briefing, which is basically an emergency briefing. And as he was doing that, I got some instructions to continue our descent, change our heading slightly. So I did that. When he came back, he said, "Oh, I've not heard that. Can you just get them to repeat it, just so that we're both on the same page?" And I went, "That's fine. Copenhagen radar, Scandinavian 123, silence. Copenhagen radar, Scandinavian 123, silence." So we think we've lost our radio at this point, which, makes matters, 100 times worse. But it's very easy, it turns out. If your radio has failed, you just fly the flight as you were going to, and air traffic control get people out your way. But in the end, it turns out radar was on the phone to tower to alert them that we were coming in. So at that point, we've at least got our radio back, which is good. They then said, "Oh, can you continue doing your fast approach like you normally do?" And we said, "No, we're going to need 20 miles going as slow as possible," which in our case, in a CRJ, is about 114 miles an hour, which is still quite fast, really. But the captain very nicely said to me, "I hope you don't mind. I know it's your flight, but I'm going to land this one." I went, "Oh, all yours. You have it. It's been a stressful day anyway. You have this." But as we were turning onto our final approach, the captain's screens failed again. And he went, "Your aircraft." So I had to grab it, flew it. And then as we started our final descent, the fuel gauge failed again. And suddenly the plane started saying, "Low fuel, low fuel, low fuel." Now, of course, with low fuel, you have to land anyway. You're right there. So we continued. Captain took over once we had the gear on the ground. Brakes applied, my hands were shaking. But ultimately, it's really, we're trained for this. It's very like the simulator. It was easier than the simulator. The simulator, you lose an engine, you lose screens, everything fails at once. Whereas this, whilst it was a cascade failure, it was nothing that we couldn't handle, which is really what I want to emphasize to the listeners, that we're trained for nearly every eventuality on the aircraft. In fact, one of the sims that I did had our thrust reversers deploying in flight, and the plane becomes practically unflyable in that. There's practically 0% chance of that happening in real life, but we're trained on it.
Yeah, and that's very similar for air traffic controllers. So we're trained every year. I think, are you 6 months for pilots?
Every 6 months, yeah.
Yes. Air traffic controllers are trained every year, and it almost becomes automatic, which is the whole point of it, that when a pilot, God forbid, ever says Mayday, 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 you automatically go with the standard reply, which then gives you thinking time, because you don't have to think, what do I say now? You just go through the standard procedure. So I think, people that worry about something happening, is you are really highly trained, as you say, probably more than you need to be, which is great. So you said about your hand shaking. I still remember my first emergency, which was actually the most serious one. I think I'd been qualified for about 3 or 4 years at that point. But it was a night shift, or end of an afternoon shift, where we would go onto a handheld microphone if there was nothing really on frequency, rather than wearing the headset that we'd normally wear. And I remember it was a shuttle, which is a British Airways aircraft on a domestic flight. And it was from, I think, Scotland to Heathrow, and somewhere about just south of Manchester, he declared a Mayday. And normally a Mayday is basically the most serious emergency for those that aren't familiar. And normally most pilots sound fairly calm, even when something goes wrong, because again, it's your training. But he sounded pretty scared. He basically had one engine that had gone out, and the second one was, as he put it, running rough, which he thought meant he might lose another one. And I mean, as a controller, that is pretty much probably your worst scenario, because if he loses both engines, they can glide very well, but knowing how long it's going to glide for and what the pilot's going to need, how controllable it is, that's quite hard for a controller. So at this point, my hand was literally, it was on the mic, like shaking as I was acknowledging it and racing in my mind about what to do. So I asked him where he wants to divert, because as Ed will know, it's down to the pilot what they want to do. At this point, we don't tell you what to do. We ask you what we can do to help. So he wanted to go into Birmingham, because he was kind of just north of there. And in this scenario, we're trained basically to keep you in the vicinity of an airfield, because what you don't want to do is vex you all over the sky away from the airfield, and then suddenly it gets worse. So yes, I was basically keeping him sort of in the overhead of Birmingham until I could transfer it onto the next controller. Fortunately, he never lost the second engine, and it all landed safely, which was great. So that was an interesting first emergency, because that's really rare. I don't think in my entire career I had anything else that was even vaguely close to that in terms of seriousness. I had very few really serious ones, thank God. I had an interesting one, which was a young sort of co-pilot or first officer came on and declared a Mayday, because the pilot they thought was having a heart attack, the captain, and he sounded quite panicked, which I'm guessing if you're quite junior, that's not what you want. It's bad enough seeing someone having a heart attack, let alone then trying to fly the plane. So and that we managed to get them down. They got medical help, and then about several hours later, the captain actually phoned in and said thanks for your help, and it turned out it was just indigestion. So I think that's a little bit stupid, but I mean, unfortunately, he wasn't ill, but it did give me a slight chuckle at the time that all those poor passengers had been inconvenienced because he had indigestion. But there we go. I'm trying to think if I had any more emergencies that were of interest. I'll cut this bit of me waffling out in a minute. I definitely had another one I was going to talk about, but it will come to me in a minute. What was it? I was going to talk about loss of separation. That was it. So the other kind of emergency for a controller, which I'm guessing you don't see much of, but I'll come back to you in a minute, Ed, is a loss of separation. So we in the UK generally use 5 miles and 1,000 feet, but there are areas where it's slightly different. And as a controller, it'd be very unlikely not to lose separation at some point. And when I say lose separation, I don't mean they're heading, towards each other at a closing speed of 1,000 miles an hour. It's more like you've just slightly misjudged something and you end up with 4.8 miles. So I've maybe had, I think, 2 of those in my entire career, and I think the closest it got was something, I don't know, 4.7 miles, where I think the first one was actually not my fault at all. It was a trainee on another sector, and their mentor had kind of lost concentration for a minute. And in fact, I think they might have been discussing something that they'd done, and it basically, the aircraft kind of wandered into my airspace very slightly, and my aircraft was right near the boundary. It's one of those things where it's it kind of relies on a bit of monitoring if you're giving them directions. So I ended up taking avoiding action. It was all fine, but we did slightly lose separation. So have you ever had to do avoiding action, Ed, and kind of what training and thought process do you go through? And maybe you could talk about TCAS as well.
Absolutely. So when it comes to seeing other aircraft, normally we can't really see them if we look out the window. They're too small. But we have a little screen, as Michelle says, called TCAS. Each plane is a little dot. It shows you relative to you how high or low they are. I've had it once, believe it or not, the same flight where the 2 passengers overdosed, where a plane came anywhere near us and their white circle, which they normally are, changed into a yellow diamond, I think it is. Nothing needed to be done. We were far enough away. Effectively, they were going west, I think, and we were going east or vice versa. And it was just that we got a little bit too close, but there was no chance of a collision. What we're trained to do is the TCAS system will tell one plane, because it talks to both planes. We'll tell one plane to climb and one plane to descend. It's very clever now. Even on our rate of descent, rate of climb indicators, it will show you a bar. And if it's red, you shouldn't be at that speed. You should be above or below that speed. And there's a little green bit that you aim for. So you'll climb away. If, for whatever reason, the other plane ignores that, the TCAS system is even more smart, and it can tell you to swap. So if you're climbing, it'll then say descend now, which means it's a change of instruction. Now, I've never had that in real life. It's very rare, I think, for aircraft to actually have that nowadays. And if a controller tells you to do the opposite of what TCAS does, you ignore the controller. You do what TCAS does because it's talking to both aircraft. You do it every single 6-month sim. It's always there. You can tell when in a sim there's very rarely other airplanes on the system, and when one appears, you hear the instructor behind you go, "Oh, Brussels Airline 123, change course 220," and then it gets more and more panicked, and you can go, "Okay, we're going to have to do this now." But we do it without thinking because it's very quick. We don't have a lot of time to react, but we get an alarm that effectively says TCAS alert, and then we climb or descend as instructed, effectively.
So I think we'll move on from the emergency stuff, maybe into an area that is still slightly unusual occurrence. And I'm sure you get this, Ed, all the time. One of the most common questions tends to be from passengers or complaints is, it's a lovely day here, it's sunny, and my airline's telling me they're delayed because of bad weather. I mean, that people think that they're lying. So can you explain a bit about why it can be, a nice day, but actually there's weather delays?
Absolutely. So there's multiple reasons. One, the aircraft may have come from somewhere where there is really poor weather. Even if the two airports are sunny, in the middle there can be huge storms. We can have to vector hundreds of miles around things if they're in the way. Safety is the most critical thing, so we don't ever fly straight through storms. We have a little weather radar, the thing you see in the nose, that basically reflects off of moisture in the air. So it works along the lines of, if there's a lot of moisture over there, there's probably a storm. So it is various different colors: green, amber, red, and then purple as the severity of it. And once it's amber, you're wanting to dodge it, but it's not too critical if you go near it. With red and magenta, you're going around it, and that can add a significant period of time. So if we're flying, say, and this isn't actually a route we would do, but if we're flying Oslo to Munich and then on to Dublin, Munich and Dublin could be fine, but in the middle, Oslo could be really bad. There's also slot delays in the middle, which aren't even to do with weather. It could just be there's highways in the sky effectively for aircraft, and if another aircraft's going to cross you when you're wanting to be there, they're going to delay you. We were once really unfortunate in Oslo to have a catering truck that broke down whilst attached to us. One of its legs refused to retract, and we were sat there for an hour, and they effectively gunned the truck and broke the leg to get us to push back. But when we got to the next airport, Aarhus, our highway had closed effectively, so we then had to sit for another hour. And the people on the ground, they see no no reason for us to be on the ground, and in some ways we see no reasons either. But it's because they're trying to do traffic management in the sky. We also once had a delay because of passengers' baggage. We were ready to go 20 minutes early, which is unheard of in aviation. And the ground crew came on and said, "Terribly sorry, Captain, there's a passenger bag that's vibrating. We need to get security over." Now, it ended up being a man's shaver. But that pretty much delayed us, and we ended up departing late. It can also be as something as stupid as we've pushed back, ready to go, and the runway's closed for whatever reason. Edinburgh Airport the other day, when I was coming back from America, we had to hold for the first time in my life to land at Edinburgh Airport because the runway was closed because they needed to do an inspection. Now, that can be because an aircraft's dropped a bit and they're just checking it. It can just be a regularly scheduled inspection. There can be animals on the runway. Birmingham at one point had a ladder left on the runway that they need to go and get. I've also had it where we've pushed back, we have de-iced, we are ready to go, and then the control has just shut the runway because there's too much snow, which then knocks on and delays the rest of the day. So it's not actually the airline's fault. It is in fact weather, but the weather hasn't impacted your later flight. But the plane or crew were delayed because crew can come from all different places. I don't necessarily work with the same captain all day. We can swap halfway through, and that first captain may go off to a flight. The second one might be delayed, in which case we just have to wait.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realise that you work with different people. I kind of thought you would all do the same schedule.
Well, they're trying, at least they're getting better at it. And particularly during COVID, when you didn't want to expose people to a lot of people, it didn't switch as much. But yeah, we change aircraft, we change crew. Our cabin crew can be completely different. Each person and each base with my airline has a different roster and what's allowed and what's not. And so some people will time out earlier than others, and so they have to go home. Captains got fed every 5 hours from Denmark, whereas I, being from Estonia, got fed every 6. So it can be as simple as things like that, trying to make all that match. And it's a really intricate game. I mean, the airline got a lot better at not swapping us, because we at certain airfields had 25 minutes to turn around our aircraft, so a very short amount of time. If you add in changing the crew and changing the plane, you're not going to make that. So they were getting a lot better, but there were definitely days where I was rostered on that 5-sector day. I was rostered with one captain the entire day, but because he was a simulator instructor, they needed him in the sim. So after the first flight, his roster changed. He had to get off the plane and position to Copenhagen so he could be in the sim. And they called out a Stockholm pilot to fly with me for the rest of the day. So it can be, that in fact did cause a delay because the captain was on a different inbound flight. And then our first plane needed maintenance, and so we moved to another plane. And to anyone else, Stockholm was fine; there was no issue. But it was because the first plane had a issue with its nose gear, and the captain had to be swapped out. So there can be a whole bunch of reasons that the passengers never see.
So it's not always air traffic control's fault.
No, it's not always air traffic control. Sometimes
actually with weather, it is generally, well, not our fault because we don't invent the weather, but it's actually for us probably one of the highest workload scenarios. So to kind of give an example, where I used to work, I mentioned that I did a sector from London to Manchester, and that's called the Daventry sector, and it's a bit like the equivalent of the M25. It's very busy with lots of highways or lanes of traffic that are actually done by controllers rather than aircraft flying a route. So we basically vector everything going in 2 directions, so exactly like the M25, all 5 miles apart. So it's just a funnel into Heathrow, Gatwick, London City, etc. And the problem is with weather is that pilots, as you say, will want to divert. They don't want to fly through a thunderstorm or cumulonimbus clouds because of the turbulence, etc. So we're kind of at the pilot's behest as to where they want to fly. And in that sort of scenario, if you get a big amount of cloud right in the middle of the sector, you can end up with like a tiny fraction that is actually usable. And weirdly, we can't actually see where the clouds are. We can't see weather on our radars, which I think people don't necessarily appreciate, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see any of the planes because it would be too cluttered. And we also find pilots quite often, the same pilot going through the same bit of airspace will go, well, I actually want to turn left, and then the next one will fly straight through it, and then the next one wants to turn right. So you can't predict what they're going to do. It's very unpredictable, and we don't like that as controllers. We like to know this is how it's going to go and this is what we're going to do. So that really increases the workload. You can be sitting there with one person happily doing it all, and then within half an hour you've literally got every position open, and it's still too busy. So what happens is we put those regulations on to try and calm down the traffic until the weather has moved. So yeah, it is kind of our fault, but it's a highly stressful and a high workload period if you get really bad weather in the wrong place. But my question to you, Ed, is it always seemed to me that pilots, funnily enough, as soon as they heard people saying, oh, there's weather, can I divert, they all seem to want to turn directly towards their destination. Is that just coincidence?
I'm going to say yes, it is just coincidence. No, we like to go as direct as possible. It's very convenient when we're in Norway, for example. Our route would have 10 points on it, say. As soon as we're up, because Norway is a very open airspace, they will say direct Copenhagen, and our route is just one straight line. Now, there are some airports that we fly into that's just not possible. It's convenient if there's a weather excuse, but for Munich or in fact Birmingham, we pass through some of the busiest airspace in the world. We pass through London on the way to Birmingham, and Munich itself is incredibly busy. It can mean that we are brought down every 2,000 feet, rather than just our preference is to have a continuous descent from 30,000 feet straight to zero, not revving up at any point other than in an emergency. But that rarely happens at busy airports. They want to bring you down in 2,000 feet chunks. Munich in particular, like saying descend 10,000 feet, but do it at this very specific airspeed or this very specific descent speed, which is a bit stressful for us because it means that we have less time to work things out. Whereas when we have a long direct leg, it's easier. We don't have to do quite as many calculations. But obviously, if it's incredibly busy, that's what we do. With Munich, Geneva, they send you, 20 miles the wrong direction to turn you around just to get you in line with all the other aircraft. Copenhagen, we're lucky because we're local. They sneak us in. So the approach starts at 3,000 feet, but because they know us, we can get in at 1,500 because we're fast. We're quicker than the A380s. So yeah, direct routings are brilliant if we can get them, but in busy airspace. I mean, during COVID, it was great because you could fly Edinburgh to London direct. That's unheard of now. You route us over Glasgow first and then down past Manchester, which makes sense. It's a traffic jam mitigation.
So I'm sure, Ed, as a pilot, when you tell people what you do or your friends are chatting to you about your job, you get the certain regular questions all the time. What Absolutely. Are your top questions that people ask you as a pilot?
Well, the first question I get asked a lot is, does the captain let you fly the plane? Yes. In fact, more often than not, the captain wants me to fly more than him because the captain has other things to be thinking about. So me taking that rather menial task off his chest or her chest is helpful. In emergencies, a lot of the time, the co-pilot, the first officer, will be flying, so the captain can be thinking about things. So yes, I'm just as well trained as the captain in some cases, because I've just come out of sim training. I'm slightly better in some aspects than the captain is. Manual flying, for example, we do so much of it in the sim that you don't do on the line. But obviously the captain has a lot more experience and a lot more knowledge about the aircraft. So that's why we sit in the two different seats, and it's why there is a ranking system. And then people always ask me what types of planes I can fly. I can only fly the one. It is technically possible to be licensed on 3 different types in Europe, but it's rarely done. TUI, I know, fly pilots on the 7.3 and the 7.8, but they do 6 months on one and then 6 months on the other. I just fly the CRJ 900. Type ratings cost a lot of money. It's 30,000 euros for a CRJ type rating, roughly. So individuals don't tend to pay that. The airlines tend to pay that. Unless you're working for Ryanair, they'll try and make you pay for it. But I only fly the one type. You could fly other variations of the CRJ, but my airline doesn't have them anymore. It used to have CRJ 700s. And turbulence. Turbulence is a big thing that people ask about. It's not fun. We don't like it particularly, although it does put some cabin crew to sleep. They like it when they're in the bunks. But we can't see it on our radars. That's why we don't avoid it, because we can't. The only hint we have is on the TCAS system. You can occasionally see the plane in front of you bobbing up and down with the numbers, but we can't really do much about it, because there's an assumption that with heavy weather, storms, magenta, you can see that there's probably going to be turbulence there. As you said, we can't fly anywhere near thunderstorms. We have to be at least 20 miles away from them. So you can see that, but there's a whole type of turbulence called clear air turbulence, which we can't see. That we have no technology to detect that. So we'll fly through it. Effectively, though, it's just different air pockets meeting each other, and it's easier to think about it like a boat on the ocean on waves. We're just going slightly faster, so it's a little bit more bumpy. As far as I know, there's never been aircraft lost to turbulence on route or anything like that. There's been downdrafts on approach to airports before, but we now have a warning system called wind shear, which is where wind from one direction changes and it's now coming from another direction. The plane will go wind shear, wind shear, wind shear, and we climb away at full power to make sure we don't end up in the ground. So we're trained for that. Turbulence, it's incredibly uncomfortable when it is severe or even moderate, but it's perfectly safe still. The aircraft are tested. Their wings are in testing are bent upwards to be more than, I think it's 1.5 G. So they're supporting 1.5 times the weight of the aircraft normally, and to make sure they don't snap. So they're really well designed. They're normally over-engineered, the A380 in particular, incredibly over-engineered, too heavy, arguably. But yeah, turbulence is completely fine. It does remind me of a story going into Munich, where I was 3 weeks on the line, very, very early in the process, and we had a little weather report for Munich, and it said possible turbulence. And so I turned to the training captain and said, "Do I tell the passengers?" And he went, "It's up to you," which is not really what I wanted to hear. I wanted a yes or a no. So I decided at that point, because we are given quite a lot of autonomy, even at that early stage, I decided to turn the seatbelt sign on at 15 minutes to go rather than 10, give my announcement, and just said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're on approach to Munich. They've said there might be some turbulence. We're not sure. So just to be safe, we're putting the seatbelt sign on now. If you could return to your seats, cabin crew prepare the landing." So that means all the trolleys and stuff are tidied away, so there's nothing to fly around. And about 2 minutes later, it was the roughest turbulence I've experienced, where I was straining at my straps, and the captain in a panic turned to me and went, "Did you tell them?" And I said, yes, I did. And that calmed him down. But yeah, turbulence is fine. It's not going to damage the aircraft, really.
Yeah, we used to have quite a few requests to change levels for turbulence, and it's interesting because it's sort of categorized as, moderate or severe, but we always used to see such a difference. It's very subjective, and generally a sort of moderate turbulence to a Brit is severe to an American that's worried about lawsuits. And I think, I'm sure people watching this would know, whenever you fly on an American airline, you end up with a seatbelt sign on virtually the entire flight, because the slightest bit of turbulence, they slap the sign on, whereas that doesn't happen so much in Europe.
Yeah, one of the problems as well is once we turn the seatbelt sign on during flight, sometimes we forget about it. If it's turbulent, we'll put it on, but unlike other phases of flight, we don't have a checklist to turn it off again. So there definitely was one time where the training captain was quizzing me on various different systems, and we got a phone call from the cabin crew saying, "Oh, can you turn the seatbelt sign off again?" And we'd had it on for half an hour without realizing. So sometimes it is worth telling the cabin crew, and they can check with us.
Yeah, I might not have tried that on an American airline.
No.
Yeah, it's interesting. We, as air traffic control, I definitely get asked two questions very regularly. So the first one I always get asked, which is the number one question, is it stressful? Or that must be super stressful being an air traffic controller. And actually, no is the answer. In fact, sometimes it's actually quite boring, particularly at night, because you would generally work, I think it's 10 till 6:30. And when you first go in, there's very little traffic, and it kind of dies further towards midnight. And then there's really nothing, because most airfields are closed at that time. And then just as you're reaching your tiredest at about 4 a.m., all the transatlantic flights start coming. So it's you have to sort of suddenly wake yourself up and start controlling. But generally, most days are fairly sort of normal. The times you earn your money, as we discussed earlier, things like weather or when there's something unusual happening that day, like, for example, I don't know, an air display or airspace closure, or we're working with the military because they quite often have military activity that close certain routes, etc. So that's kind of where you earn your money. But fortunately, that's far and few between, and generally it's more in the summer that it's very busy, as you would expect with sort of holiday traffic, and then it's a bit more stressful. But you do, at least over the winter, like particularly November's a very quiet month, you get that bit of respite to kind of recover, and you do get regular breaks, as I explained earlier, so that helps you kind of deal with it, and you're trained very well to deal with any sort of stress. So no, the answer is not as stressful as you think, but you do earn your money every now and again, that's for sure. And the other thing, I think people don't understand that there are different types of controllers. So I nearly always get asked, what airport did you work at? And actually the majority of controllers don't work at an airport, because if you think about it, obviously I'm preaching to the converted here, Ed, but once they've taken off, how do they all stop bumping into each other? Because as you said, you've got TCAS, but you're not like controlling the plane yourself in terms of missing traffic. That's what we do. So basically there's the airport, and then there's approach, which is generally based at the airport, but not all of them. And in fact, even the airport tower control now is not based at the airport in some instances. So I don't know if you're aware of this, Ed, I'm sure you are, that London City is now, the whole tower is a virtual tower, and it's controlled down at the main centre, down on the south coast, which is Swanwick, which I find absolutely fascinating. And they have like a virtual tower where it's like just like looking out of the window as if you were standing in the tower at London City. And then the approach controllers for London as well, for Heathrow, Gatwick, etc., are based at Swanwick as well. But generally in most other airfields, it's actually based at the airfield. And then the bit that I did is called area control. And there's two parts to this. There's what they call a terminal controller, which will deal with, for example, London. They have a very complex piece of airspace there, and there's specific controls that just do the area around London at low level. And also Manchester is another example where there's that sort of controller. And then I was more of what a standard area controller does at high level. So I was basically making sure that all the airways that cross each other, it's not like the M25 where they all go in one direction, sadly. It'd be a lot easier. I was making sure they're all at different levels where they're crossing, or that we vector them so they miss each other. So yeah, I was an area controller, and that is actually where most people work. I think there's around 1,500 controllers. There used to be, I think it's probably a bit less now at that centre, compared with an airport, a small airport, there might only be, probably 3 controllers on shift at a time. So yeah, it's a huge difference in the two types. And the final myth, which I will just mention, is that I stand at an airport with baseball bats going like this. No, I don't. Can you see me standing there with the earmuffs on? It would just ruin my hair. So no, I've never done that. That's an air marshal, which you only tend to get. I'm sure you can expand on this, Ed, a little bit, but I think it's only if there's no guidance system at a small airport, or if it fails. So it's a completely different job.
Yeah, it's quite incredible what we rarely had marshalers. We had marshalers at Munich, because strangely for regional jets, you go in on the stand next to the one you're doing, and then you turn around and you face outwards. Very like London City, but slightly more angular. That's the only time we really use marshalers. Most of the time, you're right, it's a guidance system, which is a little screen that tells us to go left or right and when to stop. Some airports in the olden days, they had a tennis ball hanging, and once it touched your windscreen, that's when you stop. But one of the other things that your questions made me think of was autopilot. People think that we're just sitting there doing nothing. The autopilot is great for relieving stress from us, because manually flying a 2.5-hour route can take it out of you. But there are things the autopilot can't do. It can't take off, for example. There's no plane certified at the moment that can take off by itself, although the A350 is moving close to that. On my plane, the CRJ, we don't have auto throttle at all, so we're constantly moving a throttle to match up. But the autopilot's only as good as what you put into it. So anytime air traffic control says direct something, we have to change what it's saying. The autopilot can't understand that. Although air traffic controllers are now moving to a text-based mechanism, which makes it a lot easier. There's less chance of mishearing, but we still need to change it in the box. And also, if we are to avoid a collision, say with the air traffic control giving us avoiding action, we have to change the mode and change our heading. Say it's very hands-on for pilots still. And a lot of us do like flying manually. So, we'll occasionally go, okay, from 10,000 feet, we'll take the autopilot off and we'll fly it down from here just to keep our skills in. You can normally tell if it's pilots doing it. It's just a little bit jerkier because the autopilot's very smooth. The autopilot is very, very good at doing standard things again and again and again. Pilots are much better doing emergency things. The autopilot doesn't handle it quite as well. So that's one of the reasons, but because we're so used to it doing the standard thing, we're a little bit more jerky. But you just keep your hand in, you fly up to 10,000 feet, you fly below. There's a legal requirement to have autopilot on above 28,000 feet because the distances are down to 1,000 feet and our altimeters aren't quite as accurate. So we make sure we fly, autopilot at that point. But other than that, it is still very hands-on.
And there was me sitting there controlling, thinking you're all sitting there drinking your tea and chatting. And that's why you're not listening to me when I'm controlling. Oh, I've learned a few things. I didn't know about having to put autopilot on after 28,000 feet. So I've learned something new there.
Yeah, like when the autopilot broke that one time, we were flying illegally because we were at 38,000 feet. So we needed to descend 10,000 feet. But talking about not listening, it's sometimes as simple as our headsets. They're not brilliant. I mean, on CRJ, there's so much. We use CRTs. If you remember the televisions, with the backs, that's still the screen in it, and they have fans to keep them cool because you don't want them setting on fire. So we have to have noise cancelling headphones, which work most of the time, and then sometimes they don't. But sometimes our call signs are so similar. I've had times where I've been Scandinavian, say 6-5 Golf, and there's been a 6-5 Hotel or a 5-6 Golf. And even sometimes one of my captains responded to a United call by accident, and because we were expecting it's confirmation bias. If you're expecting air traffic control to give you an instruction and you hear that instruction, you reply to it, but it was to a United plane, and you had a very confused American going, I think someone's just responded to our call. And I was like, sorry, that's us. So mistakes do happen, but yeah, it's normally down to mishearing.
Yeah, no, I definitely had a few circumstances of that in my career. But I think the thing is that, it is super safe. I think we both want to emphasize that. When you look at, I can't remember off the top of my head what the last crash was in the UK. I mean, there was the well-known 777 where they all walked away and nobody was even really sort of injured. That's the only one I can think of in kind of living memory that's certainly as I was a controller. So it is incredibly safe and well regulated, and people are well trained and very professional. So yeah, definitely it's a great way to travel compared with some other modes less regulated.
Yeah, we also are constantly audited, pilots, engineers, and then on the line, 3 days into my training, we had a person from the Danish CAA come on and say, right, chaps, I need to see your licenses, I need to see your medicals, because we do an annual medical as well to make sure we're fit to fly.
Yeah, controllers too.
Yeah, and as you get older, that happens more frequently as well. And if you wear glasses, say, because you can wear glasses to be a commercial pilot, you have to carry a second pair with you in case the first gets smashed. And then even as simple as there being dents on the aircraft, we have to check that with maintenance. I remember I delayed an aircraft once when I did a walk around at 5 a.m. in the morning, and with my torch I found it was just a mark in the paint effectively, but we couldn't guarantee it wasn't a safety issue, so we delayed the aircraft. Our only real goal is safety. If the plane's not safe to go, we won't go. When after that incident where everything had failed, the engineers came on and went, what can we help you with? And went, this plane's out of service, we can't fly it, no one's going to fly it. And it didn't fly for another 4 months. So they took it apart to find what went wrong. It's incredibly safe. You're more likely to have an incident on the way to the airport than at the airport. So we all work very hard to make sure that it's safe. Air traffic control, pilots, cabin crew. Nothing is too little for us to worry about in that regard. So yeah.
Well, thank you, Ed. I think that's a great note to finish on, and it's been really fascinating chatting to you. I've learned a few things, which is surprising after the amount of years that I was in air traffic, but it's always great to learn some new things from the pilot's perspective. And for anyone watching this, you can find all of Ed's articles on Turning Left for Less, including some really interesting maiden flights that he's been on recently. So make sure you check out his reviews on the website. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Michelle.
Well, that's it for this week. I hope you found that interesting. If you've got any questions that we didn't cover, feel free to drop a comment below and we'll try to answer them. Next week, I'll be starting an epic journey on Air France and KLM to the United Arab Emirates and covering Ras Al Khaimah, that you may not have heard of, Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and then I'll be flying on to Oman. So I'll be reporting on lots of interesting things over the coming weeks, such as new hotels, different airlines to fly with, such as Fly Dubai, that actually have flatbed seats on an hour-and-a-half flight, and looking at what the Air France and KLM experiences are like. Until then, happy travels.